Good afternoon and welcome to the CLEAR webinar series. Our webinar today is on the big picture of climate adaptation in Connecticut, a study that was done over the last year or 18 months or so by a professor on campus, Mark Boyer, and his fantastic PhD student, Melanie Meinzer. And so just quickly before I turn it over to Mark and Melanie, for those who are not familiar with our center, we are the Center for Land Use Education and Research at the University of Connecticut. And our main role is to provide information, education, and assistance to communities, basically, the local land use decision makers, and trying to help them balance growth in their communities while also looking at the protection of natural resources. And so within that sort of broad mission statement, we have three main parts of our center. Those of us that focus on land use and climate resilience, those of us who focus on water quality with a focus on stormwater, and those who focus on geospatial technology. And all those three pieces of the puzzle kind of overlap and work with each other to provide resources at the local level. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Melanie to lead us through our presentation.
All right. Thank you, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks, everybody, for taking the time to spend a little bit of your afternoon with us. And so I'm Mark Boyer, and I'm going to be working with Melanie Meinzer here today. And I'll take a little bit of time to sort of frame the project and what we're doing here. And then I'll turn it over to Melanie partway through, and then we'll be able to take some questions and answers along the way. And as I look at the title page, I actually think that that we misnamed the title for this, and with the big picture of climate adaptation in Connecticut. It should be a big picture of climate adaptation in Connecticut, because we just really have one take on the way we're doing things and what we're looking at, because we're really looking at policy actions. And so I'm a social scientist who studies governments and environmental policy along the way, and so we're trying to figure out what's getting done, why it's getting done, how it's getting done. And I'm also, in that way, a social scientist who does sort of large-scale analysis, and so I'm not necessarily interested in what's happening in Mansfield, my hometown, but I am interested in what's happening across all the towns and looking at that big picture of things along the way. And so most of what we're talking about today is not town-specific, but sort of the aggregation of a lot of what's happening throughout the state of Connecticut. So as we move and think about these things, we have some images in front of you here, and I will admit that these are actually not Connecticut images. These are images from the Jersey Shore post-Sandy. My brother-in-law has a house down just south of Long Beach Island at a place called Chadwick. And basically, we all know what happened on the Jersey Shore, but these are the kinds of images that have begun to sensitize many of us throughout the Northeast to the impacts of climate change, the fact that we need to be doing things for climate change, and how this is going to change the way we think about and go about policy making and even many of our personal decisions along the way. If you can see reasonably well the image that's up on the upper left-hand side of those homes that are up on pylons there, you can also see over to the right side of that image that there are the creation of some sand mounds there. Those are actually going to be 20-foot engineered dunes in front of beachfront homes. And this is the town of Chadwick's efforts to deal with beach erosion and protection from future coastal storms. But all of a sudden now, when you think about the impact of a 20-foot high engineered dune, you're not going to have a beachfront home any longer. You're going to have a beachfront home that maybe you can see the ocean from up on the roof. And so there's been a lot of debate about what you do and how we go about doing these things and how we adapt in ways that satisfy our desire for beachfront living, or at least coastal living, and how we deal with the other kinds of things that come with the demands of climate adaptation in the years forward. And again, it really was probably the closest thing that I've ever been to that you could approximate as a war zone when you drove through that area post-Sandy. It really was quite remarkable. Another climate image, and I think that probably most of you that are attending this webinar today probably recognize both of those individuals. But one of the things that we find is that this is a reasonably well-known image, at least in sort of the climate change community, because pretty early on, Connecticut got in talking about climate change mitigation. And in fact, we were actually in the game, or at least so our policymakers would tell us, before California got in. And so this is actually an image from a conference at Yale from about 2004, 2005, where Jody Rell and Arnold Schwarzenegger and many other policymakers were at that conference, and it was really looking at climate mitigation, where Connecticut moved in quickly, California moved in much faster and in a much bigger way, but Connecticut has long been a leader in terms of climate change action, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. And so very quickly, and I'm sure most of you know the difference here, but I'm just going to spend a quick minute for those of you who aren't up on some of the climate lingo. When we talk about climate mitigation, we are really talking about the reduction of potential threats, and specifically greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that Connecticut jumped into very early on and in a very big way. By contrast, adaptation has been slower to take hold in many communities around the United States, and it really wasn't even until about 2007 or after that, when the fourth assessment came out of the IPCC, that we start to see a lot more talk about climate adaptation in terms of adjusting to the demands of climate change and what that brings. Now, granted, we had Irene, we had the October snowstorm, we've had Sandy, and many other events that have certainly pushed this to the foreground, and it's not to say that we're happy that those things have happened, but it really has made adaptation a policy agenda, have a policy agenda level of urgency that we haven't seen previously, and that's even been a change in the environmental community, has moved onto the adaptation side as well. And so what we're going to talk about today is almost entirely on the climate adaptation side and very little about climate mitigation, greenhouse gas reductions. The data that we have gathered has been from across the state of Connecticut, and so we have been working through phone calls and other kinds of interviews and reading and culling of planning documents and other kinds of materials that we were able to get off of websites, that we were able to get data for 154 of the 169 towns around the Connecticut, and that's a pretty good return on our sample size. And so we've really been able to pull that together, and we've created this database, and you're going to get to see some of that data to, again, give you sort of a big picture of what's going on in the state of Connecticut. Oh, okay. So one of the things that we do want to do at this time, though, is to talk briefly about or turn it over to Dave to launch a little bit of a poll to get some feedback from all of you. Okay.
Share the results, and there are the results.
Yeah, that's a very interesting set of results for a variety of reasons. One of the things that you'll find in the general public really doesn't tend to know what adaptation is. They know about greenhouse gas reductions, and so they would probably, if this was a public opinion poll, the response would be probably overwhelmingly on the greenhouse gas mitigation side of things. And so this may be a sampling, a reflection of our sample today, and it's great to see that adaptation and both of these things are up on the agenda for the folks involved. And now, Dave, there's a second question there. If you could launch the second poll, please.
Sure. Yeah. Here's the results.
Very interesting, and as you'll see in a little bit when I turn this over to Melanie in just a moment here, these results are reasonably close to what we're finding in our own data, and so it's pretty reflective of about a third of Connecticut towns aren't doing very much at all, and then some others are doing a variety of other things, and we do see probably the higher profile things that we're seeing are in terms of our data collection are competitions for solar panels, so greenhouse gas mitigation, other kinds of, replacing electrical bulbs, again, greenhouse gas mitigation. And so those kinds of things are very much on the mitigation side. We tend not to see much of the adaptation stuff that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes here. So,
yeah. Hide
okay.
Results.
Yes.
And you should be back with your slides.
Very good. And so I'm just going to take a moment here just to lay out one thing. One of the things that underlies all of the pieces that we're working on is that, I started out as a political scientist by training and have moved away from that in many, many respects in lots of different ways. But increasingly, to deal with the kinds of issues that I've been working on in environmental policy, we really have to recognize that we are in a very systemic type of structure where humans and the environment interact in very direct ways. And I think that probably most of us on this webinar would recognize that, but in many respects, many of our elected officials have yet to do so. And so that's one of the struggles, is trying to put that the coupling of human and natural systems together and to keep that in the forefront of the policy agenda as we move forward. So very quickly, I just want to spend a moment talking about some of the policy drivers, and you'll think about these along the way. So one of the things that I want to just lay out for you is to think about what drives public policy in your domain, and what do you think are the primary drivers for climate action? And I've listed a number of them here, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a few minutes with our data. And the particular ones down sort of in the second half of that slide about need response. A need is identified and some policy response is developed. You can see policy diffusion. We're learning from our neighbors. Various institutional reasons, the way electoral competition and interest group influence affects things. Administrative capacity. If you have the expertise, you can do something. And economics. Affluence leads to discretionary policy choices. And so, Dave, if you could launch the next poll, we'd be curious to see what the other attendees are thinking are the primary pieces of policy driving forces in their area. Well, we must have a very smart group on the webinar today, or either that or you've read our slides somewhere else along the way. Because this is actually quite close to much of the data that we're going to be presenting, that there's a lot of policy being driven by that need response, the threat of climate change, and we'll get into that in just a second. So to me, that's a very interesting set of responses from the viewers today. Thank you very much. So.
Be back?
Absolutely. Okay, so let me just show you, along those lines, we can see some of this mapped out across the state of Connecticut. So we have three progressive map images here. One is showing the number of towns in dark blue that have state-mandated natural hazard mitigation plans. And so obviously there's a lot of the state that has natural hazard mitigation plans that are FEMA approved, that have gone through collaborations with DEEP along the way. When you move up to the next level of climate adaptation preparedness, a vulnerability assessment, now note that it's only recommended by the state, not mandated, you have many fewer towns involved, and the dominant group are along the coast. I mean, that again fits with that need response model. And then when you move up to the highest, arguably the highest level of climate planning, are state recommended climate action plans. And there as well, you get mostly coastal communities involved in climate action planning. And so again, that threat-driven process is pushing things along pretty clearly, as evidenced by the mapping and that we've shown here visually. This next slide shows the same data, but in a numeric form, just to give you a sense of what's going on here. And very clearly, you see much higher levels of compliance with that planning process for coastal communities than you do with either riverine or inland communities. And just for folks to note, riverine communities were coded along the three major river systems, the Housatonic, the Connecticut, and the Thames River Valley. And interestingly, at least from my perspective, there's not much difference statistically between the riverine communities and the inland communities. A lot of very similar patterns of compliance to these policy planning issues. And overall, about 80% of the state has had natural hazard mitigation plans approved by the state, but much, much lower when you get to climate action planning and climate vulnerability assessments. So I'm going to turn the speaker over to Melanie for now and let her spend some time with you on some more of our data.
In Table 2, we are looking at different types of adaptation policies across those three categories that Mark outlined, so coastal, riverine, and inland. And there isn't too much variation in terms of the capital improvement policies related to adaptation and median number of zoning policies related to adaptation. And to clarify, the way that we gathered this data was to look through town planning documents, so capital improvement plans and zoning codes, wetlands, regulations, for all of these towns, and we looked for policies that were related to increasing resilience or a town's ability to adapt to climate change. So the most common capital policies and zoning policies that you see in Table 2 are really related to adaptation only, not the whole document on its own. Looking at the most common capital policies, so what are towns actually spending money on? Pretty much every category, the top priority was improving drainage infrastructure, which we can link to adaptation through increased precipitation. Also connected to that was preserving open space. Nearly every town that we looked at was doing some kind of open space preservation, whether by purchasing it with town money or working it into the development regulations. Turning to the right-hand column, most common zoning policies, we see some variation there, especially with coastal towns. That top point there, restrict coastal development. That came up in very many of the coastal towns. And that concern was also linked to water quality and flooding, but coastal, riverine, and inland towns were also doing a lot of zoning related to open space and floodplains as well. And now, Dave, I think we have the next poll.
Okay.
So this poll asks what the local level barriers to climate change adaptation are in your town or region. Yeah, so again, to echo Mark again, this is very much in line with what we found in the towns as well. Some slight differences, but lack of funding and other issues taking priority certainly came out, and skepticism as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so that question leads into our next table. We asked the towns when we called them, we talked to town planners, and we asked them what they considered the greatest barrier to them taking further action on climate change. And it was a free-form question, so they could answer in any way they liked, and then we grouped their answers into these categories. So I'm going to go through this table, and we'll talk about variation across the coastal, riverine, and inland towns. First off, as a number of you noted in the poll, lack of funding. That was actually the top barrier listed by town officials. And it's relatively uniform across the different town categories. In terms of insufficient state and federal coordination, that was something that came up a lot too, and it reminded us of that map that we showed you earlier, the 3 maps of Connecticut showing the levels of compliance with different climate change related town planning documents. And we found that towns really, although there was guidance on climate change adaptation at the state level, they weren't really receiving the same degree of support for climate change adaptation as maybe they had for a state and federal mandated program like the Natural Hazard Mitigation Planning. So that could explain a bit of that response. And this next slide, so we're looking at, let's see, let me just move my page here. Other issues taking priority. I think this was over half of you chose this one. And I would be interested to know, I know it's hard to tell now just on this webinar, but how many of you are writing from inland areas, because you can see the variation across the categories. Other issues taking priority in coastal towns, very low, about 13%. But it about triples as you move to the riverine and inland towns, where nearly 40% felt that their main priorities were schools and roads, which are, of course, the staples of any town budget. So there was very little left over for climate change if people were interested in it at all. We see the same thing with climate change skepticism. Again, returning to that need, response, threat policy driver model, 8% of coastal towns reported that climate change skepticism was some kind of barrier, and then this increases as you look towards riverine and inland towns. One thing that we did was to control for socioeconomic status indicators across towns to see if there was a correlation between those indicators and taking action on climate change, and we didn't find any significant correlation there. And so what we're left with is really looking at what are the drivers and what are the barriers. And so this barrier table and this question that we included in our survey really gives us an additional dimension to not only what is driving climate change adaptation, but what might be inhibiting it. Through these interviews, we collected a number of very interesting anecdotes, and I'll just share a few of them with you now, broken down by the town category. In coastal towns, one town planner said there was an issue of constituent buy-in. Constituents needed to see how climate change was affecting them personally and in the short term. That's that first point up there. So anecdotally, something interesting about that was a lot of towns were saying that when the power would go out in these storms, people would go out and buy generators. But again, that's a very individual solution to what's probably a problem that begs greater policy attention. Another official said that during an election year, talking about climate change was a political issue, and another town planner said that the greatest barrier to addressing climate change was in convincing policymakers that it was actually a problem. And that relates to the problem of trying to show people that climate change, especially in inland towns, is affecting them in a direct way. Also in coastal towns, we have this issue that there is a historical tradition of building and living on the coast. It's a nice place to live. These towns are already developed. We can't make up regulations that require people to move and elevate their homes because they're already living there. And anecdotally on this front, there was a story about a coastal community where the municipality had built a seawall on one part of the public land, but when a storm surge came through, it simply went around the wall and hit the houses behind it. And returning to Mark's diagram of the human natural systems, well, when people are impacted by natural disaster, who do they call? They call 911, they call the emergency services, so these things create an extra burden on towns. We're looking at riverine towns. I'm going to just go through a couple of these here. At the top, you see that funding issue. Money is a big issue. They might have the interest, but not the financial resources, and that is linked to staff capacity and expertise. The second point, one town planner said that the John Birch Society, with its anti-UN Agenda 21, anti-ICLEI rhetoric, has come to town and would make it difficult for them to include sustainability issues in their upcoming plan of conservation and development. And that's a problem with political problem, but also with skepticism, as is the last point, that some town planners told us that even within their own staff, they had climate change skeptics, so they were unable to push climate change up the agenda. And finally, looking at inland towns, the first point, guidelines on climate change from the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection would help, as would grants. And for full disclosure here, when our research assistants called the towns for interviews, we introduced ourselves as from the University of Connecticut, but conducting a study in conjunction with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And it seems quite natural that when the state calls and says, well, what are you doing on climate change? And then asks you, well, state and UConn, and says, why aren't you doing more? That you say, well, if you give us more money and support, we'll do more. So that might be why that answer came up so much, but it's still, I think it's still a real barrier to action. So inland towns, one town planner said that specific information on how it will affect us will help. Again, this is a challenge of not only staffing, but expertise and technology needed to forecast those kinds of impacts. One planner said, interestingly, I don't think our town will be affected by climate change because it's not close to the shores. We have this sensitization to climate change for those who live on the shores, but paradoxically, perhaps, it's almost seen as just a coastal issue. So if they're not perceiving a threat, they're not going to see the need for a response, perhaps. And the final point I want to mention on this list is third from the bottom, where one town was able to include content on climate change in their plan because they worked with their regional planning association. And every town in Connecticut belongs to a regional planning association, and it can be a way to diffuse policy from the state level down to towns, even when states lack planning staff because of their size. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mark, who will bring us to the last slide and conclude.
Well, thank you, Melanie. So just thinking about summing this up a little bit, we really did find, as we said, many of the ideas that you put forward, what's driving policy in Connecticut, fit with both our data and your own experiences. And so when we look at threats and vulnerability, coastal communities are not surprisingly more engaged with climate adaptation than non-coastal communities. That's not surprising, but we're also seeing a fair amount of stuff percolating up with inland towns. The interesting thing from a data collection standpoint, and getting my little social sciencey here, was the fact that we had to be pretty careful not to prime our interview subjects when we talk to them, because we would say something like, are you doing anything with climate adaptation? And the answer might be, oh no, we don't do anything with that. And then the question, we'd follow up with a question, so have you made any changes to your stormwater management policies in recent years? Oh yeah, we've completely revamped those, and the list would go on. And so many towns are engaging with climate change in ways that may not be particularly conscious or fitting with their impressions of what climate adaptation is, but they're probably doing it because they've felt the need and they felt the threat. Federalism, and so those institutional examples are clearly fitting here, and the relationship of towns to the state and the states to the federal government play a significant role in driving policy action. We also found that there is still a fair amount of maybe distrust is too strong a word, but wariness between towns and deep when it comes to interactions, and so there's a sort of give and take here about how do you manage that state to town relationship, and that's an issue. We also found that policy entrepreneurs are not surprisingly important. Having the right person at the right place, whether it's for their expertise or their energy with regards to climate adaptation, makes a difference. In fact, just to foreshadow what may be coming your way in the fall, I have 3 honors students who are going to be doing their honors thesis research this fall on climate leadership in Connecticut, and each of them is going to be profiling 4 towns and looking at what's happening or what's not happening in that town and how individuals have played a significant role in that climate planning process. And so if some young woman calls you, it'll be three young women are doing this, please answer your phone and please respond to them so that they can get their thesis research done, and we'll be talking about that. Local political culture matters. The degree of climate skepticism is higher in inland states or inland towns, and again, that's not surprising that local political culture plays a role there. Climate doubting does happen, whether it's in Windsor with the John Birch Society percolating up in that instance, or a couple of other towns that we encountered somebody saying, you know, I don't really want to talk to you because this is a liberal project that you're engaging in, and we would have to back off and say, well, no, it's a data collection project. We're not imposing our values on it. We just want to know what's going on. Okay. And then there's also, frankly, the climate policy vacuum that's taken place. We all know that it's been a struggle to get national climate policy legislation in place, and that the EPA has really taken much more of a regulatory approach. But that lack of action at the federal level, or the lack of certainly legislation at the federal level, has provided quite an opening for states and localities to move into that venue. And so I think that that's one of the unique things that's happening throughout the United States, not just in Connecticut, but states and localities filling that vacuum. So I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and to listen to us. We'd be happy to take questions if you have them along the way.
Thank you, Mark and Melanie. So, folks, on your control panel, you have a question box, and that's the way that you can ask questions of our presenters today. So please go ahead and type things in there that may occur to you that you want sort of more information about. We do have a couple sort of more comments, but maybe we could get your feedback on. The first comment is actually relating to one of the polls that was sent in right after the poll about local level barriers, and somebody just mentioned that they wish that there was a sort of all of the above category for all of those obstacles.
And yes, I agree with you, but we actually made a choice to see what your most important one was. So that's why we actually didn't include an all of the above category for that specific instance. But I agree with you. I understand. So.
And another comment here that should get your reaction to Mark and Melanie. It's a little bit long. I'll try to paraphrase where I can. Connecticut property tax policy needs to change. Allow towns to tax properties in hazard zones. Increase rates over the 5-year reassessment cycles. Towns to use additional revenue for funding climate action, property buyouts, and as an investment fund to help offset tax losses. Something about current law limits property tax to 70% of fair market value. So it sounds like a bunch of suggestions to things that both at the state level and local level that need to change.
Right. No, there are a lot of things, and when we've been out doing presentations, in face-to-face environments, the issue of property taxes has come up a number of times. We haven't focused specifically on the property tax issues, but there are a lot of tax and insurance-related issues that come into play, particularly for coastal communities, that are very important and would indeed need to change in collaboration. And this is where policy gets messy. It's not just talking about DEEP or NOAA at the federal level or someplace else. You have to get the insurance commission in and a lot of other places that would have to change these in collaboration with the town. So it is a very complex problem to deal with. Yeah.
Okay, next question is, how do you find out more about the climate action plan?
Is this about the state plan, perhaps? We can clarify. So there is a state-level vulnerability assessment and climate change plan that includes adaptation. And what we did in our study was survey just the municipalities and their climate action plans or vulnerability assessments. So those we found on town websites or by contacting town planners, and the state-level documents are available on the DEEP website, I believe.
Right. And if you're interested in developing them for your own town, there are a number of existing resources out there, including our sponsors for today, CLEAR, has done a lot of this work, a lot of work in this area. In fact, we're putting in a grant proposal in the very near future to NOAA to be able to provide a set of tools on climate action planning for towns throughout the state of Connecticut. So these things are out there, and whether it's me or one of the other folks in Dave Dixon's shop, we'd be happy to chat with you about how you can pursue these things along the way from a policy standpoint. So.
Yeah, and since Mark lofted that softball for me, I will just say that we do have within CLEAR a Climate Adaptation Academy that's run by Bruce Hyde and Juliana Barrett, and they are providing a lot of different workshops focused on climate change, and you can find more about that on our website. But getting back to the questions, well, will the presentation be available online? Yes, this whole presentation is being recorded and will be available online at clear.uconn.edu.
And we would also be, I am also just mark.boyer@uconn.edu. If you want the paper version of this that has a lot more of the analysis in it, and in fact some more tables and other kinds of data, we'd be happy to share that with you in draft form along the way. So feel free to shoot us an email, and we can send that out as well.
And Mark, actually, somebody just asked along those lines, will the responses of individual towns be available in a report or online? So when you get to that point, is that something we could share on our website as well?
Absolutely, and in fact, I have a contract with the University of Michigan Press for the book version of this whole thing that will contain all the data. And so, yes, we're absolutely going to make the data available. We're in the process of, writing up more and more of this material. It sort of gets bigger as we go. But ultimately, the University of Michigan Press will be publishing the output from this.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Next one is, how can home rule actually be an incentive to implement adaptation plans? RPOs are not the answer, as RPOs often work in response to community concern. And that's not me talking, that's the questioner.
Yeah. I guess at one level, home rule provides a level of independence for towns that you don't see in other parts of the United States. And I mean, it from a social science perspective, it gave us this wonderful data set of 169 data points, which you don't find very often, because you have these individual actions. The problem is that, as was reflected in some of the data about what are the priorities in a town, most of you know that, schools, snow, and roads are probably the three primary things that need to get done in any given town. And so climate adaptation, aside from how they affect those three, is probably reasonably far down the list of priorities. And so it's a matter of getting the funding you need. It's a matter of making sure it's on the agenda. But I think the fact that home rule exists in Connecticut and New England more broadly, you really do have a fair amount of opportunity to do some things. And again, this also comes back to why policy entrepreneurs are so effective, of having a leader in a town, whether it's the town planner, the town manager, an elected official, or even a citizens group that pushes this agenda forward. I think you see that the impact of individual action also plays a significant role.
And part of the reason that we studied RPAs, the Regional Planning Associations, was because some of these towns were so small that they couldn't get past the priorities that Mark just listed, and so it was a way to get climate change on the radar in places where it might not ever come up as a response to community concerns. But that was more of a rarity. I would agree with the questioner that most of the RPOs, when we talked to them, they were not necessarily taking more action on climate change than the towns that they represented.
Right.
Okay, coastal building have a higher probability of incurring storm-related losses. This is historic and not a new trend. Insurance cat models confirm this. What data do you have that proves it is a new problem?
Yeah, and at some level, it's not a matter of it being a new problem. It's that we are, at least over the last few years, seeing an increased frequency of these of such events and the need to cope with these kinds of things. And so, you know, as I mentioned partway through the presentation, you know, the environmental community was actually very resistant to moving forward on climate adaptation for many years because they thought they would lose momentum on climate mitigation. But with the advent of, you know, sea level rise, storm surge, increased incidence of severe weather, all of a sudden the environmental community is starting to talk more about adaptation being a way of folks dealing with mitigation, because you have demonstrative impacts rather than sort of diffuse greenhouse gas atmospheric impacts, which many people just can't grapple with in quite the same way. So I would you know, agree that it's not a new problem. It's something that is just we've been more sensitized to over particularly the last 5, perhaps 10 years.
Interesting. Do you know if there have been robust outreach efforts in riverine communities around climate change hazards? Many Connecticut towns suffered mightily in the floods of 1955, but that's ancient history for a new generation of Connecticut residents and policymakers.
Not in particular, and again, partly this is because we are a macro level study in that we're not tunneling down at the moment into individual towns, and so the pattern we see is that the river towns are similar to the basic inland towns, but that's not. I mean, that was surprising to us. So my guess is that there haven't been major pushes in many of those communities. Melanie?
And to my knowledge, there is not an outreach effort, but one thing that came up frequently with riverine towns in interviews was that the types of projects they were turning their attention to were things like reinforcing dams or removing them, or problems related to having a large river in their community.
Yeah.
Okay, next one is you didn't get any responses mentioning religious reasons to consider climate change. Now that the Pope is going to release a statement asking folks to consider climate change and taking care of the planet, would you think you'd get faith-oriented reasons to acknowledge climate change if you did your interviews in the near future?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and this is something that I think about a lot. Just to give you 15 seconds of background, I was raised in a family of 7 Lutheran ministers. So when I think about this, I sometimes put this in the context of the religious community. Now, the Lutheran Church is by and large on the center-left side of the American sort of conservative spectrum of religious communities, but still, you're starting to see more and more, even conservative groups in the religious community, talk about climate change from the standpoint of stewardship of God's creation. And so that's starting to percolate up. Now we're seeing the Pope come out. There are even some very, very conservative, socially conservative groups that are talking about climate stewardship and the need to focus on climate change, for very much a religious-based reason. So I think that's starting to percolate out. That's where the problems occur when we talk about these single-dimensional right-left spectrums of politics. Most people are are working on multiple levels and multiple issues, and so defining them by, whether it's climate change or abortion or religious observance becomes problematic when you start to add in how complex people's minds really are. But that's a really great question.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Next one. For folks who are wondering, it says UConn Clear when I'm talking. This is Dave Dixon. I'm an extension educator here at UConn Clear. If you weren't here in the beginning to hear that intro, but just somebody asked about that. The next question is how likely that Connecticut politicians provide funding and leadership to push state forward and address this a minefield question. How likely that Connecticut politicians provide funding and leadership to push state forward in addressing climate change issues given budget issues in the near future?
Yeah, that's a great one. And I'm sitting here at UConn where we just found out that we have a $20 million budget gap to fill for next year. So everybody's looking for the next tranche of money to be able to do what they need to do. And so I understand that. I will say that we have had a string of governors, Roland and Rel included, who have been very progressive on climate change, and so they've found ways to support this. In fact, we signed the New England Governor's Eastern Canadian Premier's Climate Action Plan during John Rowland's tenure as governor, and we saw the famous Jody and Arnold slide at the beginning of this presentation. Again, both of those administrations were pretty seriously pro-environmental, and have been moving that agenda forward. And the Malloy administration is no different. The problem is budgets are zero sum for the most part, and so finding what we need, whether it's for schools, whether it's for universities, whether it's for climate change, roads, you name it, in times of reasonable fiscal austerity is not an easy decision. And ultimately, it comes from pushing hard, citizen action, policymakers from lower levels, from towns pushing, and there's a lot to the squeaky wheel dictum when it comes to political funding, frankly.
And sort of following up on that, a question of my own is, have you all presented these results to the state in any fashion or federal government in any level?
I have a few connections with folks in DEEP and other places around the state, and they've seen my research. In fact, it actually started originally as a collaboration with 2 or 3 people from DEEP who are no longer with DEEP. They've gone off and with other organizations now. And so yes, there have been some interactions there, and the ultimate goal is to back share this material with DEEP as things progress forward.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Next question is, much of the national, regional, and state climate change resiliency efforts related to wastewater matters have focused on public infrastructure, and decentralized sewage systems typically receive little attention. In Connecticut, 40% of the state's population relies on decentralized sewage systems. Do you agree that climate change/resiliency planning needs to include decentralized systems, both water and wastewater?
Absolutely, yes. From everything I understand, there were very, very serious threats to centralized sewage systems, particularly during Sandy and Irene, for that matter. And Bruce Hyde, one of Dave's colleagues, has told me a number of stories, and I'm just blanking on the towns, of that they were in inches of complete overflow of their sewage systems into wastewater areas and other parts of their town. So it's a very serious issue that needs to be dealt with, and this is something that we need to think about in terms of sea level rise and other things. That if you're gonna site a sewage treatment plant, even a centralized one, that's going to last for 25 to 50 years into the future, it's got to be up another 25 feet from where it is today. And some of those elevations aren't going to be possible in coastal communities. And so what do you do about those kinds of things? So yes, that's a very, very serious concern.
This is a short, simple question, but kind of a big response. What changes do you foresee in how federal flood insurance program will respond to climate change issues?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I suspect, and this is not based on any data or anything else, that within the next 10 to 15 years, the federal flood insurance program is going to go away. because more and more people, and partly this is me getting questions when I go out and do talks about this, getting questions about why are we subsidizing these wealthy landowners at the beach. And I think that more and more people are starting to say, we just shouldn't be building there. And so why should we be funding folks to rebuild there? And so I think that there's a change coming. So I think it's plausible to think that that's just going to go away.
Interesting. This one you sort of have already touched on a little bit, but I'll ask it anyway. What potential do you see for municipalities' focus on climate change adaptation, helping to engender a focus on climate change mitigation, and why?
Yeah, so one of the neat things about doing interview work is you get these pithy little comments occasionally from folks. And one of the best ones that I got was interviewing a climate activist for an NGO, and her comment was, climate adaptation is the backdoor to mitigation. And her argument was that, again, something I said a few minutes ago, that it's very difficult for the average member of the public to grapple intellectually with greenhouse gas emissions and the fact that they're going to impact us 25, 50, 100 years into the future when they're dead and gone, their children are going to be dead and gone. But climate adaptation, you can see Sandy, Irene, the October snowstorm, you can see sea level rise, you can see beach erosion, you can see all of these impacts, and people are starting to get that piece. Another interview that I had with a DEEP official a number of years ago, she was talking that she was meeting with a group of Connecticut dairy farmers and talking about the fact that with increasing temperatures, they needed to do much more to vent their barns because dairy cattle are very sensitive to changes in temperature. And she said, and her words were, they got it. Finally, they had gotten it, that they had to be worried about climate change because it was decreasing dairy production. And so I think the adaptation piece is bringing home demonstrative impact to individuals who had really never thought about climate change before. And so I do agree with that activist that it's the backdoor to mitigation.
Interesting. I think that's all I see for questions. If folks still have questions, they can post them in there. If they want to sneak in a last one, the last one was a comment that someone sent in saying, please feel free to direct people to DEEP's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's climate page. And we will also post this on our website underneath the recording of the webinar. But just if folks want it, if you go to www.ct.gov/DEEP, DEEP/climate change, they have a lot of resources on there as well. And so those are all the questions that I've seen come in. Mark, could you just, and Melanie, could you just tell us your email address again in case people want to follow up with you?
Yes.
Should we type it in? Would that be more helpful?
They won't see it in the question box, but it is also on our webpage for this webinar. If you just go to that, there's a direct link to both Mark and Melanie's email addresses from there, so you can contact them that way.
So I'm just Mark with a K .Boyer BOYER at UConn.edu.
Great.
And my email address is Melanie MELANIE.Meinzer MEINZER at UConn.edu.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark and Melanie. This has been a very interesting webinar for me, on this end at least, and by the number of questions we've had, I know for our audience as well. So thank you for taking the time to pull us together. And as I said, we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our webpage. It usually takes me about 3 or 4 days to get that processed and up on the website. But again, clear.uconn.edu is the place for that. And once there's a paper version available of Mark's study, we will post a PDF of that underneath the recording of the webinar as well. So any last words from you, Mark and Melanie?
No, just thank you very much. We appreciate your time and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks, guys. Talk to you all soon.